and how your training differs throughout the year. So before we start, I just want to ask a quick question to everybody. So why do you think it's important that you plan your training? Do you have any ideas? So you can either enter it in the chat, or you can raise your hand. That should be just at the bottom of your screen, and then you can talk, and I can accept you and let you talk. Any ideas, guys? To keep it consistent? Yeah, Hugh, that's perfect. So you know what you're doing, and you can keep your training consistent. If you don't plan your training, then you just kind of pluck it out of thin air, you don't allocate time for it. So to keep you consistent, if you've planned your training, you already allocate that time. So yeah, that's a really good one. Anybody else? Any other reasons that you need to plan your training? Come on, we need at least one more before I give you some of the answers. Nobody at all? I see Sophie's typing. And some more people. Perfect. So planning your training, so you've got a view to improve your power in certain areas. So yeah, perfect. So you need to plan your training based on where you're struggling. Perfect. To build up to races, yep. So you know that you can improve your fitness coming up to a race. And to have a variety of training types, perfect. So you need to plan different types of training, and you need to make sure you have enough time to do all of those different types of training. Perfect. So I'm going to just switch to a PowerPoint now, just so that you can see some information on your screen. So just bear with me a second. And there we go. So can you all see that okay? Perfect. So why do we plan our training? To track our progress, so you can see how far you've come. So that's one of the really important reasons why we plan our training. To ensure training is effective, if you just pick random sessions to do at random times, you don't have a goal. So your training isn't going to be effective, and it's not going to be the best use of your time. So if you plan your training ahead for the amount of time that you've got, it's going to make that time the most effective. Again, to make the most of the time you have, and to keep your fitness peaking at the right times. So if you've got a plan, you know when you need to be training and when you need to be resting, and when your goal is, so that you can be performing at your best by the time you reach that goal. Also, to prevent overtraining. So this is a really important one. Everyone thinks, especially going into the junior ranks, because you need to do more duration, because you're starting to race longer races, you want to ride as much as you can. But if you ride too much, you'll end up overtraining. You won't be able to improve on your fitness because you'll just be training on tired legs all the time. And you can have other things that result from that, such as illness, injury, and just not being able to race, which isn't ideal. So periodization, you might have heard of this before. So this is about splitting your training into different sections based on the time of year and other things like that. So we start with the macro cycle. So that's your whole season that you're planning. So that'll be like the whole year, and that's planning your goals and things like that. Then the mesocycles. So that's a smaller chunk. So that'll be your 4 or 6 week block. And that's focusing on specific elements. That might be an endurance block. It might be a threshold training block. It might be a short-term power sprint block, just dependent on what you feel like you need to work on at that particular time. And then microcycles are each week's training. So at the end of this, I will show you some example weeks trainings for different parts of the year, just so you have an idea of what you should be aiming to achieve at each time of the year. So we'll start by talking about macro cycles. So this is, as I said, planning your season. So we did a webinar on that a couple of weeks ago. So if you weren't available for that, that is on YouTube. So you can go back and watch that and figure out how to plan your season. And that's your macro cycle. It also is good to know when you finish racing. So that will tell you when your off season will be. And also when you will then start the next year. So how long you've got to train between off season and when you start racing again. Then we're moving on to our mesocycle. So this is your 4 to 6 week training block. Each week, your sessions will progress. So if you do, for example, a 4-week block, the first week you'll have a session, let's say 3 10-minute intervals at zone 3. And then each week that will progress. So the next week you might have another interval. So it might be 4 blocks of 10 minutes at zone 3. Or you might have shorter recovery. So it might be a 4-minute recovery in between instead of a 5-minute recovery in between. The powers might increase slightly, just push from middle of zone 3, for example, if there's specific powers, to top of zone 3. To just make that a little bit harder. Or the intervals might be slightly longer. So they might start as 3 times 5 minutes, and then they might go up 7 minutes and then 10 minutes. And basically, in these blocks, it's supposed to progress in a manner that you'll be able to complete more each week. So it helps you build the intensity and build the fatigue in your legs, basically, for it to be the most beneficial. If you go in with the hardest block first, you probably wouldn't be able to complete it. But because it's the last week of your block, you've trained your body so that each week you're a bit stronger, and each week you'll be able to complete more of the sessions. And that's how to progressively improve your performance. The last week of these blocks tends to be a recovery week, and that week just means you take a lot of the intensity out. You can still ride your bike a fair bit, but there'll be more recovery rides, more zone 2, and there'll be less of the intensity in that final week of your block. And then your microcycle. So that's just your week ahead. That's a really easy one. But that will usually consist of, depending on the time of year, it does vary a little bit, but you'll have a rest day and a recovery day, or one of the two. 3 to 5 training days. It depends on time of year. So you'll have more training days in the winter. You'll have less training days in the summer, because you'll have things like race days or pre-race rides to do within that week. So do we have any questions? I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. So if you have any questions, just pop them in the chat, and I'll answer that about these different parts of your training block. Any questions at all, guys? Right, so I don't see any questions at the moment, which is fine. If you want to type the questions in the chat, and then I'll answer them at the end. Or we've got a couple of questions coming in now. So one from Ben. So I'll wait for that. So how far into the future do you plan? So usually you plan about a year in advance. So in terms of, you've got your plan, so you know how to split it. And then for each training block, you'd plan 4 or 6 weeks in advance. So you'd plan each mesocycle one at a time. So for example, if you're in the middle of winter, you know you'll want an endurance block next. If you're coming into the race season, you'll probably want to do some more threshold stuff. But we'll talk about what we put in each of these blocks in the next part of the webinar. And Ben's just asked after the block, should you do a recovery week? So perfect. So you can either, depending on how you want to do it, you can either include it in your block. So if you have a 4-week block, for example, you can have 3 weeks progressively getting harder, and then your 4th week can be your recovery week. Or you can do it as a 4-week block of each week getting harder, and then do a recovery week. But yes, I would definitely recommend at the end of a block, or just after a block, to have a recovery week, because that allows you to recover and be fresh going into your next block. And then you can build more progressively, and that also helps to prevent the overtraining that we talked about earlier. So I'm going to go back and share my screen again, and we can continue having a look through the presentation. If you do have any questions, please pop them in the chat while I'm talking, and I'll just answer them at the end. So, stages of training. So I was talking about some of these earlier. So you've got the off season. So that's at the end of your race season, where you have a bit of time off. Then you've got your winter training. So that's October, November through to January. Pre-season training is from January until you start racing, and then obviously race season is through the summer when you're racing. So starting with off-season, you can usually have 2 to 3 weeks of off-season. Depending on what you're doing, that might vary. So, for example, if you race cyclocross and road, you might have a slightly shorter off-season of only like a week. It just depends on your personal race calendar. But it'll be at the end of your season, so October, November time. Again, that will vary dependent on when your race season finishes. But you don't really do any structured training in this time. You can ride if you want to. There won't be any blocks put in. It's just sort of up to you what you want to do. You ride if and when you want to. It's a really good time of year to keep active doing other sports. So running, going to the gym, swimming, going on holiday is really good at this time of year as well. Just things like that, just so you kind of take a break from the actual cycling aspect and can clear your head as well, because obviously it's a lot of mental stress as well, like training and racing all year. With cycling, it's a sport where you've got to do it all the time, and it's constantly all year round you've got to kind of train. So off season is a really good time to switch off and just kind of go and do what you want to do, and having social time, which you can't necessarily do during the race season. After off season, you've got your winter training. So that's November to about January. And it usually consists of your base endurance. So this will be zone 2 rides, which are low intensity and long duration. As a youth, you don't do necessarily as much duration because your racing isn't as long. But when you move up to junior, your racing all of a sudden goes from being an hour long to 3 or 4 hour road races. So winter training is even more important when you're making that jump from youth to junior. So look, by long duration, I mean 3 to 4 hours. You probably won't, especially as a junior, you won't need to be doing those long 5 hour rides that you see people doing, because your races just won't be that long. If your races are that long, then that's what you need to do. But if you're racing for 3 hours, there's no massive need to train for 5, especially with other commitments. You can utilize that time a lot better. For endurance training for a junior, I'd suggest trying to increase the duration of all of your sessions rather than just focusing on a really long ride. So rather than doing an hour turbo, doing an hour and a half turbo, and just things like that are really good ways to increase the duration without it feeling like you're doing that much more. In the winter, again, if you are doing efforts, they're usually just to break up from it just being endurance all the time. So you do tempo or maybe a little bit of sweet spot, but that'll be towards the end of your winter training. And it's just like the zone 3 works. So that's so a little bit harder than you normally would be doing on your ride. So you can feel the tension and you can feel the effort, but it's not something that you wouldn't be able to maintain for a long period of time. And it just breaks it out of that monotonous power levels. So we'll talk about a bit more about that in a minute. So sessions we can talk about that you'll probably see in a winter training session. So I said earlier about 3 or 4 hour zone 2 endurance rides, and that's just to get your baseline fitness up, because the higher your baseline fitness is, the higher your top end will be, because you've got a higher base to start from. You might do some longer tempo efforts, so that could be 10-minute efforts just below your threshold power. So we talked about threshold last week. So that's your the maximum amount of power that you can maintain for an hour. And you do 3 blocks of 10 minutes that is just below that. And those sort of efforts help to increase your threshold power. So that means that you'll be able to sustain a higher power for longer, basically. That's what that's to work on. But you tend to stick towards your lower training zones, so that's zone 2 and 3. Just mainly work on that base endurance over the winter period. Sorry. So how does winter training change if you race cyclocross? So you keep the basics the same, But each week will tend to be slightly lower in duration, just because if you're racing, you've not got the time to do as many longer rides. You'll also see a bit more high intensity work. So these will be sessions like 40-20s and short sprint sessions, just because that helps to prime you for the racing. And you'll also see a bit more rest in the schedule because you're racing, so you need to make sure you're a bit fresher than people who are just training over winter, so they can afford to go a bit deeper into that training and be a bit more fatigued because they've not got anything that they need to be performing for. So pre-season training, so this is just after your winter training block. So that's from February to April, when you're just about starting racing. So this can also overlap with some early season racing. It's just where you're starting to introduce the higher intensity and thinking about the sessions focusing on the recovery between efforts rather than focusing on the actual effort itself. So some examples of this are like 40-20s, like I suggested in the cyclocross season. So 40-20s are when you do a 40-second effort and you have 20-second recovery. You can also do it the other way around if you want to work specifically on shorter term sprint power rather than recovery. But this basically helps you be able to recover more quickly from an effort. So that's why that's really good to do pre-season. And it also helps just to peak that sprint power. Over-under sessions are also really good. So that's where you ride at threshold and you dip below and above. So you do like 3 minutes below, 3 minutes above for the effort, for the duration of the effort, and just keep alternating. And that just basically helps to, again, just bump that threshold power up. And again, we've already spoken a bit about threshold. So these will be small, higher intensity efforts than you would have seen in the winter training block, and they'll be more frequent. So most of your efforts during this time of year will be effort related, whereas if you looked at your winter training block, there'd have probably been 1 or 2 effort sessions a week. This time of year, there's probably going to be more. And if you're not, if you're doing an endurance ride, there will probably be efforts within these endurance rides. They won't just be pure endurance anymore. Then we're moving on to race season. So your quantity of training will decrease because you'll be racing, so you'll have to be fresh for those races. So you'll have more rest days, and you'll have more. We have activation rides, which are lower intensity rides, and the duration will decrease because you won't want to be fatigued for your racing. You'll still have some key training sessions, 1 to 2 of these a week, with specific focuses on areas that you are wanting to improve or areas you feel like you're lacking in your racing. So we're talking about activation rides, but I've not really mentioned what an activation ride is. So they're usually short durations, but they can be anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour and a half, maybe even 2 hours. It depends on the sort of effort that you're preparing for. They usually include a longer effort. So this could be at tempo, or this could also be in the form of a build. So sometimes there can be like a ramped effort where your power slowly increases and it gets harder and harder. So you do a minute at a higher intensity and keep building up. There'll be some form of sprints just to get those legs sharpened up. And there also might be some medium duration efforts like a 1 minute effort or a 3 minute effort, just to sort of tap into all of the different training zones. So you've had a little bit of a taste of everything before you go into your race, basically. So here's a couple of examples when we're talking about what a winter training week, for example, would look like. So on a Monday, you've got a rest day. Mondays tend to be rest days for most people, just because with work or school, Monday to Friday, you don't have much time and you have a lot of time over the weekend. So you tend to have a need for a rest day on a Monday because you've worked hard over the weekend. So Tuesdays, you could have like a turbo session with tempo, and that's just because you want to split up your efforts. So you don't want to be doing a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday efforts, because by the time you get to your Thursday efforts, you're going to be absolutely knackered. So you want to make sure that you space out your sessions in a way that you will be able to recover so you can get the most out of both of your sessions. It's also good to make sure that you get some form of endurance in during the week. So Wednesdays tend to work out nicely because you can have the intensity on a Tuesday and a Thursday, but then you've still got time to do a longer ride and recover between the two, because even though you're training at a zone 2, you can still recover a little bit. Whereas if you're doing another effort session, it would just dig that hole a bit deeper. Recovery ride again on Friday because you've had 3 days of pretty hard training, and you want to be fresh for your weekend where you've got to get the most hours in, and that's where the bulk of your training will really occur time-wise. I've also put in some gym sessions. Somebody was asking when we were speaking about gym sessions, how do you put that in with your normal training? So here I put a gym session in on the Thursday because they've got a recovery ride the day after. So that gym session won't affect the recovery ride the day after or 2 days after when they'll feel it most. They've got an endurance ride, so it's not going to be massively detrimental because they've not got any efforts, so they can just ride at zone 2. Here it's a bit different with this gym session. It has got efforts 2 days after it, but it's got a day in between where there's not much intensity, and it should be long enough that the gym effort will be sort of recovered from. So now we're moving on to pre-season. So here you'll see the efforts have changed a bit. So you've got more threshold and high intensity efforts rather than tempo and low intensity efforts. The general format is relatively similar. You've still got these long rides at the weekend, but you've progressed from having little efforts or sprints in these longer rides to having actual effort sessions within the longer rides. But you've still got a high duration for the week and a high workload because you're not racing yet. The gym has changed a bit. So the gym here has been put on the Wednesday. So when you're going to feel it worst is on a Friday when you've got a recovery ride. And again, the same with the gym on the Saturday. So you're feeling it most on the rest day. And again, the session the day after the gym won't be affected here. And because these efforts are high intensity, so these will be sort of sprint efforts, the gym won't affect those sort of efforts as much because you don't have the time to feel the fatigue. And then we'll move on to race season. So this is slightly different. So you'll notice in this week, you've still got your rest day and your recovery day, but you've also got a pre-race ride. So this is, as we spoke about earlier, this is a low duration. And then you've got your race, which is still a long duration, but because you've got an extra low duration day, so pre-race ride, your general duration for the week is lower. This again, you've still got the key sessions, so there's similar sessions to what you see in pre-season. So you've still got the sweet spot on high intensity efforts, but you're giving a lot more time for recovery before the race, and you're just sticking to those 2 key sessions rather than having a lot more key training sessions. There's only really 2 key training sessions in the week. So with all of this that we've spoken about today, consistency really is the key. Planning is only useful when the sessions are completed. So if you plan a week and you don't complete the key sessions, there's no point you trying to then move on the next week to the next session in the block, because if you've not completed the first one, you're not going to be able to complete the second one. So it's really important that you keep your training consistent, because otherwise you're just going to plan for failure, and you don't want to do that. You'll just end up getting demoralized. So it's really important that you try and keep your training consistent. And if you don't, then realizing that and going, okay, well, we'll try this week again next week because it didn't go to plan. You can't change your focus after, if you haven't completed the training. So, for example, if you've not had a good winter, there's no point moving straight from endurance to higher intensity efforts if you've not done any endurance. You need to make sure that endurance has been done before you commit to doing the higher intensity. So that is all from me tonight. So thank you for listening, guys. Any questions at all? Please put them in the chat now, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So I can see Sophie's typing. Anybody else got any questions? I see a question here. If you come to the start of the season, go to a race and find you're way behind where you need to be, would you step away from racing to build fitness again, or hope to race to fitness? It depends. This is a really good question. It depends on your personal experience. So if you find that you tend to race to fitness quite well, so this is where you just put a lot of racing in and use that instead of training to build your fitness, then you can potentially do that. But if you find it's easier to train, and you think if you just go into races and start getting dropped and things that you'll get demoralized, then I'd definitely say step back from racing, reevaluate your goals, and put an extra few training blocks in. Because if you start racing in February and realize you're not quite where you want to be, there's no harm in taking a month out to focus and reset so that your goals for later in the year are more achievable. So I'd definitely say, if you find racing to fitness works for you, then that's great. But if it doesn't, and if you don't want to get demoralized, then I'd definitely say take it back to the basics, take it back to your training, and make sure that you're in the best possible state for the races that you want to do well in. We've got another question. How should a taper week look before a big race? Perfect. Thanks for asking that, Ben, because I didn't include that in the PowerPoint. But a taper week will look similar to the week that I showed you as a race week. But because you're tapering towards a big event, you'd probably have a lot more rest. So the Thursday session, where I still had a high intensity session in, would look something more of an endurance ride or something that was a bit less intense, just so that you knew that you'd definitely be performing for that race. So that's the main difference between a taper week and a normal race week. A question from Hugh. Would you do recovery for early season races that don't matter, or use them as almost training? So that's completely up to you. I think, again, it depends on how much you value those results early season. Like, for example, if you need points, you might need to recover a bit more because you need to get the points you need to do well in them. If you're not bothered necessarily about the results and you're just using them as training, then you can quite happily cut down on the recovery, do a really hard week into it, and just know that you probably won't perform at your best because of that. But it is a really good tool to use as training as well. Oliver's asked, because I've done a cyclocross season, I'm doing winter training now and haven't yet moved into pre-season. Is that okay? Yeah, that's perfectly fine. But you just need to realise that when you're planning your race calendar, because there's no point you aiming for a race really early season if you haven't got that intensity in yet. You'd be better making sure that if you're doing your winter training now, you know you're going to go into pre-season a bit later, so your aims for this year will be later in the season. Alternatively, if you've done a cyclocross season, you might also come in and say, oh, well, I'm going to try and extend that fitness and carry that fitness through some early season races, and instead of doing later ones. But from what you're saying, later season, what you're doing is perfectly fine. Last question is from Harrison. Does it matter what order you do on the bike or gym training on the same day? So it's up to you. It doesn't particularly matter. There's pros and cons to both. So the quality of your bike riding session will be really good if you're doing it before the gym, because you've not got any of the effects of the gym in your legs. It depends on the session as well. If you've got a high intensity session, the gym won't really affect it, so you can do that afterwards, and it helps to your muscles to associate that strength that you're building in the gym with the cycling. But if you're doing an effort that really requires quite a high level of energy, you'd probably want to be doing that before the gym, just because it'll take a lot out of you doing the gym work and then trying to do, for example, a tempo effort or a threshold effort, sorry. So thanks everyone for joining. So the key take homes from today are consistency is key. If you're not consistent, your training is not going to go as well as you want to. Making sure you plan ahead, that you've got your 6 weeks planned out in front of you, and also making sure that your recovery is enough, so you're recovering at least once or twice a week. So thanks for joining us tonight, guys, and I look forward to seeing you next week.